A product classification system defines discrete regulatory categories. Each category carries a different compliance burden, creating a cost gradient tied to labels. Producers are not rewarded for reflecting true product variation, but for falling into the lowest cost category. Design decisions begin to align with classification thresholds rather than functional differences. A small difference in product attributes can shift a product across a regulatory boundary. The cost difference between categories amplifies the importance of that boundary. Producers begin adjusting specifications to remain just within the lower burden category. Product design starts to cluster tightly around the threshold. The classification system treats categories as binary, while real products vary continuously. This mismatch compresses diverse products into simplified labels. The label becomes the dominant signal in the system. Underlying variation becomes operationally irrelevant. It appears that products are naturally grouped into these categories. However, the grouping is not driven by intrinsic similarity, but by regulatory positioning. Producers converge not because products are alike, but because incentives align them to the same boundary. Observed similarity becomes an artifact of the classification system. Regulators enforce rules based on category labels, not on nuanced product differences. Compliance processes reinforce the importance of staying within a favorable classification. Crossing the boundary introduces disproportionate cost and procedural complexity. Avoiding that boundary becomes a central strategic objective. A producer facing the boundary evaluates two options: cross into a higher category or adjust the product. The cost structure makes adjustment the dominant strategy. Edge case packaging emerges as a systematic response. Products are engineered to pass classification tests rather than to optimize performance. As more producers adopt similar adjustments, the boundary becomes increasingly crowded. Minor specification differences are engineered with precision to remain compliant. The system exhibits boundary compression, where variation is artificially reduced near thresholds. The distribution of products becomes distorted. The classification label is visible to regulators, markets, and downstream systems. Decisions are made based on the label rather than the underlying product structure. The label begins to substitute for reality in operational contexts. Signal replaces substance as the primary decision driver. It appears that the system is functioning efficiently, with products neatly categorized, but this apparent order hides the loss of meaningful differentiation. The system no longer reflects actual variation in products. It reflects strategic alignment to classification rules. Once a product is classified, it enters a stable regulatory position. Reclassification requires significant cost and procedural friction. The initial classification decision becomes a long-term constraint. Producers design upstream decisions to avoid future reclassification risk. Product development pipelines begin incorporating classification constraints early. Design choices are evaluated against category thresholds before performance considerations. The incentive structure propagates backward into the design process. Classification logic becomes embedded in production systems. A coordination pattern emerges across producers facing the same regulatory structure. Independent actors converge on similar boundary-optimized designs. This convergence is not coordinated explicitly, but driven by shared incentives. System-wide homogeneity increases. The system no longer distributes products according to natural variation. It distributes them according to regulatory thresholds. The boundary defines the shape of the market. Market structure becomes a function of classification rules. Attempts to differentiate products within the same category yield limited advantage. The dominant constraint is remaining within the favorable classification. Innovation is directed toward compliance optimization rather than functional improvement. The system prioritizes classification fit over product diversity. The regulatory framework stabilizes around observable labels. Enforcement and monitoring reinforce the importance of classification compliance. Feedback loops strengthen boundary-focused behavior. The system becomes self-reinforcing. Over time, the cost of deviating from the established classification strategy increases. Producers that cross into higher categories face structural disadvantages. The system penalizes deviation from boundary-optimized designs. Strategic flexibility declines. The classification system appears neutral, simply organizing products into categories. In practice, it reshapes production incentives at scale. Behavior adapts to the structure of classification, not to the intrinsic properties of products. The system encodes incentives into design choices. The equilibrium stabilizes when most producers operate within the lowest cost category. Products cluster near thresholds with minimal variation beyond what classification requires. Category labels dominate decision-making across the system. A category-driven distortion defines the final state. As the boundary becomes crowded, regulators rely increasingly on the category label to manage oversight load. Inspection processes are simplified around whether a product meets classification criteria, not how it performs within the category. Producers respond by optimizing documentation and test conditions that confirm classification status. Verification begins to track compliance signals rather than underlying product behavior. This creates an information structure where the label is high visibility, while internal variation remains opaque. Regulators observe compliance consistency but cannot easily detect divergence inside the category. Producers exploit this asymmetry by maintaining just enough conformity to pass classification checks. The system reinforces alignment to visible criteria, while masking internal differences. Over time, classification criteria become the primary design constraint across the industry. Product specifications are reverse engineered from regulatory thresholds rather than functional requirements. Small adjustments near the boundary are replicated across producers facing identical constraints. Design diversity collapses into narrow, threshold-aligned configurations. At scale, the accumulation of edge case designs alters the meaning of the category itself. The category no longer represents a coherent class of products, but a collection of boundary-optimized variants. Regulatory labels drift away from their original intent. Classification becomes a proxy that no longer maps cleanly to underlying reality. Despite this drift, the system continues to treat the category as stable. Operational decisions downstream rely on the assumption that classification reflects meaningful differences. Producers have no incentive to reveal deviations that remain within the category. The gap between classification and actual product behavior widens without triggering correction. Because classification is assigned once and rarely revisited, early positioning becomes critical. Producers invest more effort up front to secure a favorable category assignment. This shifts resources toward pre-classification optimization, rather than post-launch adaptation. The system locks in early decisions that shape long-term behavior. As more products enter the same low-burden category, regulators face increasing volume without increased resolution. To maintain throughput, they standardize checks even further around classification signals. Producers anticipate this simplification and design for predictable evaluation paths. The evaluation process becomes easier to satisfy but less informative. The boundary itself gains strategic importance beyond its formal definition. Producers begin to treat it as a target to be engineered against, not a line to be respected. Measurement tolerances and test conditions are tuned to ensure consistent classification outcomes. The system tightens around the boundary as the central organizing constraint. At this stage, crossing into a higher category is no longer a marginal decision. It represents a structural shift with long-term cost implications that cannot be easily reversed. Producers avoid transitions even when functional improvements would justify them. The system suppresses movement across categories. A feedback loop forms between classification stability and design behavior. Stable categories encourage boundary optimization, and boundary optimization reinforces category stability. Neither side has an incentive to reintroduce variation that would disrupt the equilibrium. The system becomes resistant to internal change. Scaling amplifies this effect across the entire regulatory domain. As more producers adopt similar strategies, the distribution of products becomes increasingly concentrated. The classification system processes larger volumes of similar boundary-aligned products. System-wide distortion becomes normalized. At the same time, the cost structure remains asymmetric. The penalty for misclassification into a higher category persists, while the reward for precision within the lower category remains stable. This asymmetry continues to anchor behavior around the boundary. Deviation becomes structurally unattractive. It appears that maintaining strict classification criteria would restore alignment. However, tightening thresholds increases the value of precise boundary optimization. Producers respond by refining edge case packaging even further. The same pattern intensifies rather than resolves. The system reaches a point where classification determines not only compliance, but also product identity. What a product is becomes inseparable from how it is classified. Design, production, and regulatory interaction all align around this single dimension. The system converges into a classification-driven operating mode. At equilibrium, most products are engineered to sit just inside favorable categories with minimal deviation. Regulatory processes operate efficiently on simplified signals, while underlying variation remains compressed. Producers remain locked into designs optimized for classification stability. Category-driven distortion persists as a stable, self-reinforcing state. Within this stabilized system, remaining inside a favorable classification becomes the primary objective. Design choices are evaluated by their ability to preserve category status rather than expand functional capability. The system now rewards boundary precision and ignores underlying variation. Products that drift too far from classification thresholds trigger disproportionate compliance costs. Even improvements that enhance performance become liabilities if they risk crossing into a higher category. The system now penalizes deviation more than it rewards innovation. What was once a classification tool becomes the central organizing constraint of production. The label dictates how products are built, not how they are used or differentiated. Behavior narrows toward maintaining alignment with classification signals. Producers no longer optimize across a spectrum of possibilities, but within a constrained zone defined by regulatory boundaries. Actions outside this zone carry structural penalties that outweigh potential gains. The system locks behavior into a narrow band of acceptable variation. The equilibrium holds as long as classification remains the dominant signal guiding decisions. Products continue to cluster at the edge of favorable categories, reinforcing the same pattern across the system. Behavior remains aligned not with product reality, but with the incentives embedded in classification.